I'm with Jonathan Feldstein from the Genesis 123 Foundation. We've just had Joe Biden come to Israel. How do you feel the trip went?
I think the trip was fine. I think that it could have been a lot better, and yet on the other hand, it could have been a lot worse. One of the things that was kind of nice and charming is that you saw President Biden be personable and demonstrate that he's not a stranger here in Israel. It was his 10th visit. Immediately at the airport when he arrived, he was very warm and embracing, and that followed when he visited with Holocaust survivors later that day. So I think the tone wasn't right. I think his politics are probably mistaken, and I think some of the messaging of his trip was problematic and actually could be more problematic if they continue in that kind of vein.
Do you think he had anything to offer for both Israel and the Palestinians?
So for the Palestinian, I don't think he offered very much. It seemed to me like they were sort of the stepchild. If I'm in Jerusalem, I can't not go to visit Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. It was interesting that he didn't go to Ramallah, but he went to Bethlehem. And other than restoring some money and donating some money, $300 million, and there's nothing, no one should turn their nose up at $300 million. I don't think that was much that they got out of it, other than maybe repeating some slogans. As far as Israel, I think also the general answer, Israel didn't get very much out of it. It was a lovely visit. I think it's important with our election coming up that certain politicians be seen with the president. But I think on a substantial basis, there wasn't a lot. The two things that I would say, one positive and one negative. The positive being that it seems like there was movement, at least to publicly help Israel and Saudi Arabia come closer with various relations. When he was here, it was announced that the Saudis would allow direct air flights over Saudi airspace to anywhere in Asia, anywhere in the world, and that's very important. I think that something was discussed vis-a-vis Iran. Who knows what will come of it? And yet the big troubling thing for me, not just his rhetoric about two states and diplomacy vis-a-vis Iran, which are policy things that I think he's wrong about, but when he visually decided that in going to a hospital serving Palestinian Arabs in eastern Jerusalem without any Israeli representation, although, mind you, his security didn't change. All the security was provided by Israel, and yet they took the Israeli flag off the presidential limousine and replaced it with an American flag. And I think that both by going to the hospital in eastern Jerusalem without any Israeli representation and taking the flag off and repeating his pledge to open a consulate for the Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem, these are all very dangerous underminings of Israeli sovereignty.
Do you think that was a snub in one sense? Because we all know that Donald Trump actually opened the embassy in Jerusalem. So do you feel that was a snub?
Well, I think that for too much of Biden's presidency, he's been trying to be the un-Trump president. And to his credit, he didn't come into office and say, well, we're going to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv. So I credit him on that. But yeah, there's no question that it's a snub. And part of it is sort of the schizophrenic look where one can actually look at Joe Biden and say he has a career of being friendly to Israel. 40 plus years in the Senate, and he's not anti-Israel. But his party is becoming much more anti-Israel. So it was clear that he had to throw bones to the extreme left anti-Israel members of his party, and also recognizing that there's a midterm election coming up, so you can't be too pro-Israel. Because no Democrat, even if they're pro-Israel, no Democrat is running on a staunchly pro-Israel platform at this stage. So he had to balance it, and I think that was definitely a snub, whether it was intended to be a snub or not. I think that was part of his balancing and the schizophrenia that's taking place in the Democratic Party, which used to be largely pro-Israel.
He's committed to the two-state solution, but is the two-state solution dead?
I can't say if it's dead or not, but it's definitely on life support. To his credit, he landed in Israel, and when he went to meet with Mahmoud Abbas in Bethlehem, he said in both instances that this two-state solution is not practical now. I'll say this, whether it should or shouldn't be, I have no ability to imagine the two-state solution being practical in the foreseeable future. I've become friends with Christian Israeli Arabs over the years, and some of them say to me, well, not only is there no practical two-state solution, but there's no practical peace between Israel and the Palestinians or Palestinian Authority. So I fault him for coming into Israel, repeating the same old diplomatic and political rhetoric that hasn't worked for many decades and clearly is not going to work now. You don't have anyone in the Palestinian Authority who's either for that, for actually realizing a two-state solution, or for that matter, who's capable of delivering that with and can be relied upon. And in Israel today, the further we get from that, the less interest there is in a two-state solution.
What's the pressing issue for Israel right now?
The pressing issue for Israel is Iran and stopping Iran. And it was also very interesting when President Biden spoke on the same platform with Prime Minister Lapid. Biden reiterated that the best solution for Iran is diplomacy. And it was very interesting, and I think out of character among heads of state, to have the Prime Minister directly rebuke that notion in public. Now, of course, we have an election campaign coming up, and Prime Minister Lapid doesn't want to be seen as too leftist. I actually think he probably agrees. He wasn't making up a statement that diplomacy is not the solution with Iran, but clearly that's the issue. There was a Jerusalem Declaration signed. Words are very nice. I'm more interested to know what was agreed upon behind the scenes and if there's any substantial action or timetable that we can look at to say, okay, United States, let's put action behind the words that you're not going to allow the Iranians to get a nuclear weapon.
Do you think America will allow Israel to go into Iran and deal with their nuclear program? Will America support them, or will Israel have to go it alone?
Wow, that's a very good question, and it kind of makes my heart race. There are a few factors relating. First of all, can Israel go and do something meaningful and significant alone that will be conclusive? And I don't know the answer to that. I do know that whether America is involved or not, we now have new Arab allies in the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf who want to see Iran stopped as well. That's important. If the Prime Minister were to call up the President and say, we have intelligence, the Iranians are going live in 2 weeks, we're acting on Tuesday, will you join us? There's a good question as to whether or not U.S. will join or not. But the second question, which goes to the term that you used, will the U.S. allow it? Or conversely, will the U.S. prevent it? Will the U.S. leak something or somehow do something that prevents Israel from taking action? I don't know the answer to that. Unfortunately, I know the answer is political as much as it is practical. And if that conversation were to happen in the month of October, when both the U.S. and Israel are facing national elections the following month, that will change the potential, that could change the potential outcome as compared to something that happens next February or a year from February preceding the U.S. presidential election. I don't know the answer. It's an important question to follow, to be aware of whether the U.S. can be relied upon.
Do you think Biden understands the danger of Iran for Israel?
I think in concept he understands that, but I don't know if in his presidency he's prepared to make that an issue.
Now, Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. Was it right for him to do so? And is it dangerous for Biden to get back into the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, I happen to think it was right for Trump to pull out of that deal. Some people will say that the Iranians were following the deal more or less. There are some people who say any deal is better than no deal. Part of the problem with that deal is twofold. First of all, the billions of dollars that were provided, which rehabilitated their economy to a degree. And one would think, you could even forgive President Obama for thinking that providing all that money would somehow reform these Islamic extremists and that they would want to come back into the nations of the world and be a productive player rather than the greatest sponsor of terror that no one can trust. We've already proven that even with all the money, that's not a realistic. You can't buy off the Iranian quest for a nuclear weapon or their sincere desire to destroy Israel. I don't think, therefore, that going forward with any kind of arrangement is going to change, with any kind of new agreement is going to change the outcome of that in any way. And I think that if the Americans, Biden and the U.S. administration, or Biden's successor, whoever that may be, if we even get to that point when we're still having this conversation with the next U.S. president, if there hasn't been a decisive action, I think that the Americans have to take into account that there needs to be action and not just words. And signing a piece of paper or making declarations is not going to change, and certainly not providing money. And why on earth would we want to provide billions of dollars to fund an entity that has demonstrated without any hesitation that they are searching to acquire a nuclear weapon? They even made, the day after Biden left, they made a declaration that they have the know-how to do it. and it's just a matter of time if they decide to make it happen or not.
Is Iran a real threat to Israel, or is Israel just crying wolf?
That's an excellent question. Is Israel crying wolf? The answer could be maybe, but is Iran a real threat? The answer is definitely, because they refer to Israel as a one-bomb country. The kind of weapon that they would be able to produce, if they were able to produce and deliver it, would wipe out the majority of Israel by landing it in the right place. And if it launched and landed in the right place, it would be devastating. It would be, as someone I don't remember, it was Senator Lindsey Graham said, we already had one Holocaust is enough. And he was speaking about that specifically in relation to Iran at a conference that I attended recently. So, yeah, it's an existential threat, and that's why they have to be stopped. That's why we've been able to toy around with strategic strikes in Lebanon and Syria to prevent them from making progress and having too deep roots in our northern neighbors. But that nuclear weapon is an existential threat, yes, no question.
Do you see a parallel, as an Orthodox Jew, a religious Orthodox Jew, do you see a parallel from the Bible of the story of Esther, and you're looking today at Iran being like a modern-day Haman, and can God rescue his people?
Well, God can, of course, rescue his people, and the neat thing about God is he can do it with or without us, but he gives us the opportunity to participate. So first and foremost, what did Esther do? She fasted and prayed. Now, I'm not saying that anyone listening right now needs to fast and pray for the next 3 days, as Esther told Mordecai to have everybody do, but we need to be praying. God needs to hear our prayers, and yes, God can change the outcome. And I pray that rather than us having to take a preemptive strike against the Iranians, which would be devastating for the Iranian people, I pray that God will change their hearts, or that there will be a revolution within the country that oversees the Islamic government, and they can kind of come back into the nations of the world. It's not a coincidence. God doesn't make coincidences at this level, that modern Iran is ancient Persia, and the existential threat to the Jewish people 2,500 years ago is coming from the same place that there's an existential threat to the Jewish people today. And by the way, one interesting note on that, it's not, and I use the word carefully, it's not just an existential threat to Israel. We're, I think, 2 weeks from the anniversary of when Iran struck with a suicide bomb at the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires. 89 people, I think, were killed. A devastating attack. And the Iranians are also very recently, Israel uncovered a Iranian plot to kidnap and kill Israelis in Turkey, warning all Israelis in Turkey or considering going to Turkey either not to go or to come home immediately because there was an imminent threat. The Iranians are not only trying to attack and destroy Israel, they are anti-Semites, and they're trying to kill Jews everywhere in the world.
Is Biden a friend to Israel?
So I think Biden conceptually is a friend to Israel. I think he thinks so. I think he's pro-Israel in concept. I happen to like the phrase that he used when he landed. And he said, you don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist. And I believe that he is and thinks that he is. My problem with President Biden is not measuring his friendship. I don't need friends. I need people who are going to provide substance to those words. And I think that if we just look at the issues of peace with our immediate neighbors in the Palestinian Authority, and if we look at Iran, I think that his policies are tremendously misguided and dangerous. I don't think that there's any practical application for a two-state solution now, whether there should or shouldn't be, and to have that same silly rhetoric shows at best a lack of creativity, and at worst is dangerous. And the same thing with Iran. If his coming into office, and he has given no reason to let any of us think that his main goal is in reaching an agreement with Iran, that's a dangerous thing as well. Does he see that as a contradiction of his being pro-Israel? Probably not, and that's problematic as well.
Is Israel at a strange place at the moment? We're coming to fifth elections, so more elections again. Are we in a crazy situation?
Well, of course. I don't know. I mean, maybe a few other countries have had this silly revolving door of elections. It creates a situation where there's a tremendous lack of stability politically. It creates a situation where different policies are being interjected. There's no question that that's not a good thing for Israel, and on the more bigger issues relating to our relationship with our neighbors, immediate neighbors, and broader neighbors in the neighborhood, and of course Iran, and let's throw in Russia as well. Having this kind of instability allows our neighbors and adversaries to think that they can potentially take advantage. And we've seen that happen. One of my prayers for the outcome of the election in November is that we have stability. I have my political... I don't know yet who I'm comfortable voting for, but I know who I don't want to vote for. But I think over and above that, we need a good bit of stability so we can have a vision, because there are a lot of issues in Israel. Domestic issues relating to the economy, relating to the fact that in a month we begin the school year and there's a deficit of thousands of teachers in the Israeli school system. We can go on and on about the domestic problems, but we need that stability.
What's your prayer finally for Israel?
Prayer finally for Israel is that we continue to thrive, that we be the blessing, the light and the blessing to the nations that God called us to be, that we understand that that's not just an opportunity by being a strong nation state, but from a biblical perspective. As I said, we need a strong degree of stability and in our daily prayers as Jews in different language, but that we can continue to overcome our adversaries.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. It's a delight.